Well, howdy, everyone, and welcome back to the Rancher Podcast. I'm your host, Austin Halverson, and this is the third episode on the Yellowstone 1883 series where I go in depth on the history behind the episode. Last week we talked about Fort Griffin and the cattle drive that brought James and Elsa onto the trail of cattle, and we talked about the state longhorn herd that is now housed at Fort Griffin. And, it's a great episode if you haven't listened to it yet. But this week, unlike episodes 1 and 2, this is more of a traveling episode because the characters have left Fort Worth, they've left Hell's Half Acre, they're finally moving, and because of that, we're seeing more of the issues that arise from taking one of these perilous and treacherous journeys. The episode didn't have a ton of history to it. However, the main theme of the episode was really that there was this ever-present sense of death that happens on the trail. In fact, at the very beginning, we see a montage of people dying from all kinds of things. I mean, bad water, snake bites, wild dogs. We also see a man that's crushed by a wagon that was getting stuck. And unsurprisingly, many immigrants met their fate in a lot of the similar ways to what we saw in that episode, if not those exact ways. So today, I know it's a kind of dark subject, but I wanted to focus on the dangers of life on the Oregon Trail because I think that is the history that we kind of got out of this episode. So, of course, one of the dangers that we'll be covering in the next episode is river crossings, because that's kind of the main point of that. And there's a few other weather-related events that will occur in episode 5. And so we will talk about those when those come up. But this week we're going to focus just in general on the ways that folks met their fate on the trail. But of course, before we get into that, let's hear a quick word from our sponsors. Well, I'm proud to welcome the newest sponsor for the Rancher Podcast, and that is Elite Ranch Consulting. They are your one-stop shop for protecting your real estate investment. Whether you inherited a piece of land, bought a ranch as your vacation home, or are simply looking to maximize the land you are already working, Elite Ranch Consulting's team of experts can help you make the right decisions to make your land profitable. Visit EliteRanchConsulting.com today to learn more about how they can protect your American dream. So the National Park Service actually has a very informative web page that's, of course, got a dark title. It's Death and Disease Along the Immigrant Trails. So it talks more about all trails throughout the United States, but of course, the issues that arose from these trails were all fairly similar. And in their larger section on this part of the National Park website, it's actually called the Immigrant Experience. And it's pretty unique because it talks about flow and travel of people within the United States. So immigrant as in EMIGRANT. It's a really interesting page because it talks about from the beginning of American colonization all the way through to the move and the expansion westward, all of the stories and experiences of the folks who made those treks. But on that page, the death and disease page, they note that the most common causes of death were as follows. The first, of course, was disease. Second was gunshot wounds. And third was accidents, which gunshot wounds and accidents, I mean, sometimes the wounds were due to accidents. Number 4 on that list was river crossings and drownings. And then, of course, one of the last but definitely not least was the weather. And, after watching a few episodes, I think you would agree with me that it seems as though director Taylor Sheridan probably kept a list of these things in the writer's room because as far as we've gone in the show, folks have died of all of these already. And so I think that, if you want to talk about the history and how it connects to this show, I think they're doing a really good job if you want to take that list as your lodestone, your guiding principle. So let's go ahead and break these down. So first of all was disease. And the National Park Service website says that this was the top killer by a country mile. I mean, they estimate that 6 to 10% of all people who ventured onto the trail died of some disease. Now, I'm going to reiterate that because I did not say that 6 to 10% of people who died of a disease. No, I'm saying 6 to 10% of anybody who stepped foot on the trail had a chance of dying of disease. So your odds, as soon as you even started on the westward journey, were, somewhere between 1 in 10 and 1 in 12, which is certainly not something that you want to really think about. But I do think, again, as I mentioned last week, that it really is a testament to the courage and strength and sheer willpower of these folks that they even decided to go on this journey to begin with. So when you factor that in, disease was a major killer. And if you've ever played the game Oregon Trail, which is of course a computer class favorite for all of us who grew up in the computer era, then you likely have you can probably rattle off the names of the diseases that were the top killers because you probably lost your whole family to them a few times, like I did, because that's definitely part of the game. But for the sake of those who were not lucky enough to play Oregon Trail, I did want to talk about these diseases and just how pernicious they were. So the first one of the diseases is cholera. And it's number one amongst the diseases because it's the worst of the worst. According to the National Park Service, cholera was something that resulted from waterborne bacteria that would thrive in the polluted and stagnant water. In larger cities, you might see cholera outbreaks because of infected drinking water that's contaminated maybe even by sewage. And out on the prairie, that might not be as true from human sewage, but wild animals could contaminate it through their own feces, but then also sometimes an animal would die and fall into the water, and if it was stagnant, then that could produce problems. So this disease is really pretty rapid. It attacks the intestinal lining and produces, of course, severe diarrhea, vomiting, and abdominal pains and cramps. If you remember from episode 2, a lot of the immigrants were actually getting sick from what I believe was cholera, and we saw a lot of them doubled over in pain by the riverside. So it was something that you usually died within 12 hours of the first symptoms, and some of the medicine that they were trying to use to combat cholera or camphor and laudanum, which if you know anything about medicine, those are not things that are going to treat the sickness itself. Those are simply painkillers and cough suppressants. So I mean, it was essentially a death sentence, and it killed quite a few people. It was the number one killer amongst, of course, the number one cause of death on the trail. So number 2 is dysentery, and it's similar to cholera because it typically stems from unsanitary camping and lack of hygiene when it comes to food and water. Now, immigrants on the trail would use castor oil to try and treat this, which they said was a way to soothe the bowels. That does not sound like it would be a great way to treat dysentery today. I know one of the main things that we do today, if anyone has something similar to dysentery or cholera, is just try and maintain fluids and kind of ride it out on top of some of the medications and antibiotics. So perhaps the castor oil was able to soothe the bowels by providing a little bit of hydration and lubrication, if you will. But up next is mountain fever. And I know, this still happens today, and it's usually not fatal even back then, but it would again provide intestinal discomfort, respiratory distress, and a fever. So many of the diseases that fit these symptoms are things like Rocky Mountain spotted fever, typhoid fever, and one that I've actually had myself, which is scarlet fever. At this time, just like with malaria, quinine water was used to treat the Rocky Mountain spotted fever and the chills and pneumonia that came along with it. So, quinine was something that the British had kind of figured out was effective against malaria, and that's where the famed gin and tonic came from. Was the way to get the men of across the world that were in the British military that were building the empire to get them to drink their medicine. The gin and tonic became a great way to convince them to take down quinine or tonic water, which if you've had is you would know that by itself does not necessarily taste that great. So another one on the list is measles, which of course we have the MMR vaccine today, but we do see outbreaks in children. And, it was very common amongst the children back then. I know people back then, just as throughout the 20th century, would have measles parties or chickenpox parties to make sure that kids got it because it would help build natural immunity. But, of course, just like today, measles and chickenpox and these types of diseases could have a very serious effect upon adults. Now, next, this one I found quite humorous. I know it's hard to find anything humorous in an episode like this, but food poisoning was another major contributor to death on the trail. And that's not the funny part. What I thought was the funny part was that the National Park Service actually made an effort to point out that the food poisoning illness was something that was particularly common amongst single men. So I will let you interpret that how you will. But I just found it kind of funny that they have the statistical record to, analyze and point out that this was something that most unmarried men were having difficulty cooking food properly or storing it properly. So, I just thought that with all this information that we consider today, the men not being able to cook, I guess, was something that was more true back then than even today. Up next on our list of who's who when it came to deadly and dangerous diseases is another one that I'm sure many of you are familiar with, and that is scurvy. Now, scurvy, I know that most people are aware that this was something that folks would get pirates and other men that lived on ships, but it really can happen anywhere, and it's a disease that weakens and deteriorates the body conditioned, and it results from diets that lack vitamin C. So that's why they always talk about having lemon and lime juice on ship vessels and other things to try and provide as much vitamin C as possible. One thing that I recently learned about scurvy that is makes it way more disturbing than I had thought of it before. I always knew that it was a terrible way to die, but I didn't understand exactly how this happened. But scurvy actually eats at the body's tissue, and it starts with scar tissue. And what that means is that essentially every wound your body has ever had, every little scar that you have, begins to reemerge as that scar tissue is eaten away. So if you think about it, over time we all accrue bumps, scars, whatever. And so when you see these movies or TV shows that depict scurvy and these people are covered in scabs and their gums are rotting away or whatnot, it's it's actually their former injuries reappearing, which makes it way more disturbing than I had ever thought of. It's quite a nightmare of a disease. And citric acid was actually one of the major ways that they prevented scurvy, which, of course, like I mentioned, is something that you could pull out of any type of acidic fruit like limes and lemons. But when you get out into the middle of the what was known as the Great American Desert on the plains, there's not too many citrus trees out there. So I know that Native Americans actually discovered that a good source of vitamin C was to utilize all of the organ meat of the bison, specifically the bile out of the gallbladder and other things. So really an interesting way for you to combat scurvy. But I mean, if I was faced with that or all of my previous injuries and scars being eaten away, I think I would choose the former. Then, of course, smallpox is on the list. As I mentioned in the first overview of the 1883 series, there was a vaccine for smallpox at this point, and that vaccine had been around for decades. However, smallpox was very contagious, and because of that, lingered quite a long time even after the vaccine, and it would cause a high fever and dehydration, along with the, of course, namesake marks that covered the individual's skin who was suffering from smallpox. So we've seen this one, of course, in the series as well. I feel like so far the only one we haven't is scurvy, and so we'll see. Maybe as the adventurers or trekkers get further and further from home, maybe scurvy will make an appearance. I sure hope not for their sake. But another very common one, and one that we see today quite a bit, is pneumonia. And pneumonia to this day is a very risky thing to contract because it affects people very differently, and it was nearly a death sentence in the unsanitary and remote plains where the weather was ever changing. Any of you who grew up in the middle of the country like myself know just how fast the plains can range from 40 to 80 degrees and vacillate between those and vice versa. It's quite a fickle place. I know here in Oklahoma and Texas, we always joke about how you can have all 4 seasons in one day. And I do remember there were quite a few days where I would have to show up to work in a giant Carhartt jacket, and by the afternoon was shedding it for my short sleeves. So it's hard to imagine how that would how you could deal with that without the shelter and climate controlled rooms that we have today. And I think that one of the things we don't really consider is just how barren and desolate the plains were. One of the things that we really don't appreciate, I guess, today is that there was not really much shelter on the trail. In a future episode of 1883, when they're faced with a tornado, there were no holes for them to hide in. There were no storm shelters. They really just had to find the lowest elevation and hunker down. And I mean, it's just unimaginable how difficult that would be. But outside of diseases, as I've been talking about, other accidents and weather were major issues. So countless numbers of trekkers were actually crushed by the wagons, which of course we did see at the beginning of this episode, or animals, or some even drowned, which we'll talk about next week with the river crossing episode. And there are even accounts of buffalo stampeding the wagon trains. I actually saw a very interesting portrayal. It was a painting of wagons going across the plains, and there's all these buffalo actually running through the wagon train with Indians in pursuit of them. And I don't know how accurate that is. I mean, it seems like a great portrayal of the West because you've got all the characters there, but I don't know. I know that buffalo did indeed stampede through wagon trains, but I don't know about the presence of Native Americans, or if Native Americans actually would push buffalo to try and mess with wagon trains like this, but certainly was an issue that could have arose. So, as I mentioned, in the next couple episodes, we will see them facing two of these major challenges: a river crossing and severe weather like the tornado. Um, and you know, again, you have to think about, this place was called the Great American Desert by the early explorers. The Spanish gave it that name. And I know when I was growing up in Oklahoma, and I heard that term, as somebody who, learns about deserts and knows about the Sahara and whatnot, of course there is a technical definition of a desert, but I have to imagine that it looked pretty desolate to people back then. I mean, it's very different today, but there was not the shelter, the hospitality of the woods. It was quite literally a desert. It was deserted. So the more you learn about all of this, the more unbelievable I think it is that so many people even made this journey, and that so many people made it successfully. Again, you think about 1 in 12, 1 in 10 to 1 in 12 was your chance of making it just based on disease. And then you have to factor in all these other things that we've talked about. From a historical perspective, all of these experiences have come up in 1883. They're all true. These are the things that these families faced in the 1800s. And, I can't recall how many times during the show I've thought, you know what, I think it's time for them to turn back and head towards Fort Worth, because that's what I would have done. I mean, the first time I lost everything in my wagon, I don't think I would keep going. But that's just the difference between these folks and me. These determined people kept pushing forward into the danger in hopes that on the other end, there was a better life for them. And, again, I think that this is going to be a recurring theme in these episodes, because I find it just almost unimaginable. But the bravery and the gratitude that we should have towards these individuals, are key themes of this podcast, because the more you learn about it, the more difficult, the more impossible these trails seemed. So I want you to, if you have someone in your family who made a journey like this, it doesn't have to be on the Oregon Trail or whatnot. All of our families made sacrifices and made incredibly hard decisions to come to America, whether it was by boat to, New York and then railroad to wherever, or they made a more dangerous trek. They all deserve the respect and thanks of our generations that have better lives than them because of their sacrifices. So I wanted to leave you with that. But if you wanted to read more about the dangers of the trail, Outsider.com actually did a great article about 1883 just a couple weeks ago, and it links the information about the death on the trail to what's going on in Yellowstone 1883. So I'll link that in the description, along with the National Park Service page that I used as a reference. But there's also, of course, plenty of books. I know many of you read about the Oregon Trail in history class, or of course played the video game. But a unique book that I would recommend is called The Oregon Trail: A New American Journey, and it's by a man named Rinker Buck, who him and his brother actually went and decided that they were going to be the first two people to tackle the trail in over 100 years. So in the early 2000s, these two brothers built a wagon that their father was actually a wagon enthusiast, and so they built that with the experience and knowledge they had from him, and took off down the trail comparing historical perspectives and diary entries and whatnot to what they were experiencing in their trials and tribulations along the trail. So I think it's a really interesting book because it has the historical aspect to it, but it also talks way more in depth about just how difficult a journey like this would be. So that's all I have this week, and I want to thank you all again for tuning in. And so until next time, Godspeed and God bless.